How's everybody doing?
Hey, you doing well? Thank you for joining. Man, this is like this man segues are working out nicely because we were just
Look,
talking
it
about
is. This is what I'm excited about
writing
now.
effectively, getting your concept across. And hey, look, our next presentation, I totally planned that is on asking questions and writing effectively. Christopher Lopez, I'll read your little bio here before we break it to you. So Christopher Lopez, bio says, my name is Christopher Lopez. Obviously, no, wait, no, that way. That's Christopher Lopez. I'm Jeff McJones. Christopher Lopez is a father first and a SOC analyst second. If I were to say, sorry, if Christopher were to say he had a superpower, it'd be the ability to ask questions. Thank you, right? Being able and willing to ask questions, even if they seem like silly or stupid questions, is in fact a superpower. I wish more people had and used that superpower. This is what go by Christopher or Chris? I'm assuming Christopher.
Whatever's easier, honestly.
What Christopher feels his work as analyst mainly consists of asking the best questions to drive our analysis. Yes, questions are far more interesting than answers, I think. Been in the InfoSec field for a few years, been a SOC analyst throughout. Chris came from IT, been very fortunate to have great people around to learn from. Oh my goodness, this theme of learning from other people and sharing that learning, I am happy that this track is emphasizing that through, and our speakers are as well. Chris enjoys understanding how an analyst investigates and jumps down rabbit holes to learn how things work. Yes, sometimes rabbit holes are worth further investigation because there are answers out there. This is why we have lab environments. This is why we have forensic artifacts and kind of the ability to make good questions and answer them that sometimes takes your own somewhat original research. And that's fine. This is how we advance as a community and advance as a field. So with that said, Wesley, do you have any last comments before we break away and give it to Christopher?
No, I'm ready for this presentation. I'm excited about this one.
I'm excited for this one. So Christopher will drop off and let you take it away. Just so you know, we have 30 minutes allocated for your talk. It does not mean you have to end at 45 after on the dot. We have a little bit of wiggle room for Q&A and banter, and I stole 2 minutes from you. So Christopher, take it away, and thank you very much.
All right, perfect. So we're going to cover asking questions and writing effectively today. As was already mentioned, this is one of my favorite topics. I was very fortunate, like I said in my bio, to have people around to guide me because I didn't understand anything about cybersecurity or InfoSec or whatever we want to call it when I first started, right? So definitely something I'm passionate to talk about. Okay, so this was also mentioned a little bit. I'm a father. That's kind of my most important role in life. And I've been a SOC analyst, an investigator for all of my career within InfoSec. And all I do is ask questions. If anyone would ask someone that knows me personally, they would say that, yeah, Chris talks a lot and he's always asking questions about stuff. It just helps me understand things better. So the agenda, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about questions. There's going to be a lot of that here. We're going to talk about how to ask questions, why they matter, and how that works into the investigative engine. And then we're going to pivot over to write-ups because this is how value is derived from your analysis as an analyst, right? So it's really important to be able to translate the answers to your questions in the most effective write-ups possible for your leadership to make decisions. And of course, this is all based on the SOC analyst perspective, since that's what I am. So just keep that in mind as we roll through this. Okay, so here's the best part. The tools to be an awesome investigator. You don't need that much. You need your mind, right? Your questions, that's in bold for a reason. We're going to keep going through that. Your biases, very interesting. Just the way that you think about things is really important to keep that in mind and be aware of them. Your perspective and your experiences. It doesn't have to be an InfoSec related experience. It can be, you learn how to ride a bike. I don't know. You can bring that in to be an awesome investigator. So another thing is somewhere to take notes, right? I still use paper and pencil. I don't know. It just feels good instead of typing all day like I usually do. But of course, any text editor, would help you. A loosely defined process. The reason I emphasize loosely defined is because I feel that investigations really benefit from the creative minds of analysts, and having a very structured process to investigate can stifle that creativity that can come out of an investigation. So just have a guideline that you follow as you're investigating. And of course, your team members, lean on them. That's super important. There's always something to learn from everyone that you meet, especially people that are investigating things or in the same team as you. So just lean on them, and that will help you become a better investigator as well. This is the engine that we're going to focus on, right? This is the investigation engine. At least from my perspective, this is how investigations usually work. You have your questions, and with your questions that you ask yourself based on an input, right, an alert, for example, you collect artifacts to answer those questions, right? That can be logs, that can be, it usually is logs. That's what we primarily deal with. Rabbit holes come in. The reason I put them here is because they can be one of the most enjoyable experiences that you have during investigation, but they can also really take away a lot of your time. I spent a lot of time in rabbit holes trying to understand things, but they're part of the engine of investigating. Compiling your findings, right? So after you've analyzed your logs and you've reached out to users if you need to, and you've spoken to your team members, you compile your findings, and then you form a conclusion, right? You try to answer the question that we are all trying to answer: is this bad? Is this a true positive? Is this a false positive? And then you document, right? Documentation is super important. It's how everyone learns from each other, and it's how you track, what you're doing. And if there was anything that I would say to take away from this, is that documentation is key to making sure that everyone keeps getting better as an analyst. So what does that look like? The beauty here is that this is not recreating the wheel. This is not something new. We've been taught this since elementary school. We are applying the scientific method to understand how an investigation works in order to answer the question that we need to answer, right? Which is this a bad thing that happened, for example? And your leadership may need to understand that to make decisions that would protect your company or whomever it is that you're working for. So of course, there's an observation. That's your input. That is your alert, for example, or a email that's sent to your shared mailbox from users that want to contact you about strange activity. And you have your questions, right? Then you form a hypothesis, what you think is going to happen. You experiment. In this case, you pull logs, right? Or you figure out some way of getting more evidence. You analyze that evidence and you form a conclusion. It's all the same thing. And it makes me really comfortable to know that, it aligns with what we've been taught since elementary school. It makes it easier to keep it in mind. These are our questions. This is what we're going to focus on. This is the meat and potatoes of the conversation here. The what, the why, when, where, who, and how. So let's just jump into these questions. The what. I consider this to be the input. This is, I've said it a few times, this is a SIM detection, right? This is an alert, or this can be a threat hunt idea, right? There's been a lot of, breaches recently that we all are aware of. There may be some really interesting artifacts within some of these reports that may lead to a threat hunt idea to find evidence of that in your environment, right? I mentioned that here. And of course, there's always the input of a new organizational process. Many of us are going through this or have already gone through this, with our companies moving to the cloud. What does that look like? Should I learn more about this, and how do I use that to create an investigation around, like, what logs do I even have in the first place to have visibility into this environment? This is your input. This is where everything starts from. In the case of this presentation, we're going to focus on detections and alerts being your input. This is something really important. This took me a very long time to learn. So I'd like to have this right after I talk about, the questions, and that is always question the alert first. I spent so much time going down rabbit holes, which are fun, of course, but they can be very time consuming, trying to understand why this happened. Like this alert saying that this fired or this bad thing happened on this machine, and it looked super bad, especially since, I was new and I didn't understand the context of a lot of the things I was looking at. And I failed to ask this simple question of, hey, does this alert make sense? Does this, is it actually finding what it was intended to find? Is there documentation, which there should be if you're creating detections, right? Someone should know who created this detection so you can reach out to them, or they're not in the company anymore, but at least you have some context around the thought process of a detection. you need to understand why this alerted in the first place. And that can help you throughout the context of an investigation. And it can also stop an investigation before it even happens by saying, this doesn't make any sense. This did not find what it was intended to find. This is a false positive, and this requires some tuning. Because at the end of the day, as SOC analysts, we're all trying to improve our investigative practice, right? We're all trying to get better and more effective at investigating and answering these questions quickly. So tuning is part of that process. So just always remember, ask that question, does this alert even make sense? The why. This is your hypothesis. This is where you look at an alert and you're like, you know what, this looks to me like a false positive. Now, without evidence, there's no way of actually answering that question, but it's good to have some idea to drive your investigation. This is really important. And this is something that I tend to still write down somewhere. I mean, if I'm typing in a ticketing system, for example, I'll write down what I think, you know, just to keep that in mind. And this leads to the questions that you continue to ask yourself to find answers, right? An example of these would be, let's say that it's related to an AV detection, antivirus detection. This detected file does not appear malicious. That would be like a hypothesis, right? That would be what I think about this. This looks benign. This looks like someone downloading something that just looks to be malicious, but it's not. Or the phishing email that we received an alert about was not clicked. They received it, but it wasn't clicked. And then I go, right? And you build your hypothesis based on these three things that I think really help you create a really good hypothesis. And Leslie said it perfectly in the Wild West Hacking Fest this year, and I had to put it in here. Build your hypothesis based on these three things. Is it falsifiable? Is it testable? And understand the scope of your hypothesis, right? Is it limited to one machine? Is it, you know, throughout your whole environment? Can you even pull evidence or logs to test this hypothesis, right? And it's better to prove yourself wrong. It's really interesting if you go through the process of that. I believe that this potentially malicious executable did not execute, right? It did not actually do what it was intended to do on this machine. Well, I'm gonna go look for logs that try to prove that it did execute. And that helps me, you know, prove to see if something is falsifiable. This builds out the hypothesis, which is incredibly important to drive everything. And this is an example. I talked about, you know, the AV thing that happens a lot. Antivirus, you know, catches things. And, you know, this is an example alert from June, let's say. I know we're a little bit past that, but that's okay. So it detected a potentially malicious file in a user directory. And my hypothesis, I did not execute. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to find anything that I could to prove that it did. The when. Okay, so here goes the story. So I started in a SOC and I didn't understand how to do investigations very well. So I would write down questions that I should ask myself on a piece of paper in order to help me like really understand, you know, the daunting process I feel a lot of people feel when they're starting out in InfoSec. There's always so much going on. And one of the things that I failed to understand very early on was when you work for a global company and there's endpoints that you're receiving logs from different regions of the world, is to understand the importance of timestamps. So an example would be, I was trying to investigate a malicious file. There's always that happening, I guess. And it was on a machine that was in Asia, right? That's not the US, so it's a completely different time zone. And I was looking for logs within the SIM that were set to Eastern time, right? I'm in Eastern time and it was set to Eastern time, but there were logs that I had to pull from the machine itself, right? And access and, you know, be able to analyze that were from the machine, but the machine's time is different than the time that I'm looking at within the SIM. And that's something that I didn't really consider. And I ended up looking hours away from, you know, where it was that I should be looking for that evidence that I was trying to find to answer the question of did this file actually execute? And the problem with that was I was wrong. So those things happen, you make mistakes, right? And luckily I had, you know, a team member tell me, hey, did you make sure to go back to the right time on this machine, because the SIM is set to Eastern time and this is not Eastern time that you're looking at these logs. so they could be off. And that was very helpful because then I found the evidence that I needed to prove that this malicious file did execute. Now, if I didn't have that, I would have been wrong, and that would be not the best way of ending an investigation. But you learn something from this, and that's why it's super important to ask yourself the when. When did this take place, right? And to, if you can, set everything to UTC because it just makes sense and it makes your life easier. And last but not least, understand time conversions if you have to. That's something that, I'll go to Google and figure out like what time zone something is and just do the math, and just to make sure that you're on the right track, on the right page. The where. Now, the where is interesting because this could be answered with the when, right? For example, that asset was in Asia, right? But it's also really interesting to understand the where through the context of a user, because this allows you to understand whether or not this user is traveling. If this is a laptop, if this is a server, that gives you more context as to if this is a machine-based investigation, right? It gives you more context as to like what the context of this investigation contains. So is this a server? That would tell me something very different than if this was a laptop, for example, because there may be a certain amount of standards that you have towards servers that would help you answer questions as to, is this malicious, or is this just something that we've seen in our environment before that just looks malicious to this, security appliance that decided to make it, an alert. So a where is really interesting, especially with asset management, and it's a good question to ask yourself. Who? All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of attribution here. There's been a lot of talk about threat intelligence and the power of it, and I think it's incredible. But understanding the who around an investigation is really important. And I want to really spend a moment here to talk about the abstraction of a user account. This was hard for me to really wrap my head around. So just because you have a detection that lists a user account that may have done something suspicious, it's always really important to understand that it doesn't mean that it was really that user that did that. User accounts can be compromised. So it's really important to understand the who behind something and to be aware of the abstraction level whenever it is you're dealing with a user related investigation, right? So an example would be, knowing when to reach out to a user about a specific investigation, right? Trying to really understand the who, because trying to understand if this is an outsider or an insider type threat that you're dealing with. And it can even be your coworker. What I mean by that is it can be something where one of your fellow SOC analysts was downloading something because they wanted to understand something for their investigation. And we're going to keep going on the antivirus thing because it happens so much. Antivirus captured a file. It doesn't mean that your team member, their account was compromised and something malicious was executed on their machine. But what it does mean is that you should understand the context of the user account itself. So this is something that's really important throughout an investigation, understanding the who. How? This is, to me, one of the most enjoyable parts of an investigation. This is where I spend most of my time. And it's only because there's this innate curiosity that I've had, and I think it's helped me propel my career, within InfoSec, is that I just want to understand how things work. And this is such a great field to have that like innate question that you're always asking yourself, like, why did this happen and how does this work, right? So this is where you start asking yourself the question of how did this get here? And I want to spend a moment talking about that question because it's so important. And that is, okay, so we're going to keep with the antivirus thing. Antivirus captures this file, right? It is quarantined and there's no threat, right? So it's really easy to dismiss that. It's really easy to say, okay, well, there's no threat, so it's gone. But the question that should come up is, how did this get here in the first place? Why did this get here, right? Like, how is this possible to have been detected? Like, how many layers of security controls do we have in place that should have prevented this, like a proxy or whatever, that did not catch this, but it's still here? And also, how did we detect this? Was this a user that reached out to us and said, hey, my machine's acting a little bit weird, and sent us a screenshot and it looks like something's happening on their machine? Or was this a detection that we have created as a team based on some behavioral logic that we've learned about? That's really important, because the goal of an effective SOC, as was mentioned before, is to be more effective, to keep building better detections, better rules, and to better protect, the organization that you're working for. So how do we detect this is a very important question to ask, because if this was a user-related, inquiry or something that they reached out to us, maybe there's the opportunity of creating a rule around the behavior of this event. So that's just something to keep in mind. And how does this work? That's where I spend most of my time. Like, how does this file work? Why does it do this thing? And what else can I learn from it, right? So that's why we have sandboxes. That's why we have VMs. That's why, we like to detonate malware, in a safe environment to see what it does, because you can also really derive some great detections around that type of behavior. And that, again, goes through the cycle of improving your SOC. And the last question with the how is, how impactful is this, right? So we haven't talked about the whole IR, invoking IR and really going through the process of escalating an incident, to up the ranks, depending on, what level it is that you're on, in your team. But it's really important to ask this question even throughout your hypothesis creation: is how impactful is this? Is this enough to, invoke IR? Is this enough to reach out, let my manager know, right? Like, whatever process you have in place with your policy, for an investigation or for these types of events, it's really important to ask yourself often, like, how impactful is this event? Okay, so now you spend all this time answering these questions and writing this up in a really rough draft form, right? Or some ticketing system. And now you're ready for the write-up. And I just want to stress this a few times. You're going to hear it probably more than once here. An analyst's efforts is reflected through their documentation. And that's super important, because I've been a victim of this myself in a way where, yeah, I just spend the entire day investigating this, but I don't know how to communicate this in the way that the audience is receptive to it. So yeah, I can write something super technical and say, hey, this is really cool the way that this worked, and wow, like it did this thing. And us analysts are interesting, where we get really excited when something bad's happening, which is just part of the job because it's interesting, I guess. It's hard to really communicate that sometimes in a write-up. So this is just some things that I've learned from really bad write-ups that I've done, in my career so far. So some things to keep in mind. Talk about what actions you took, right? The reason this is so important is because I would love to read someone's write-up and be able to replicate their actions, right? What did you pull? Where did you pull this log source from? Like, what did you search in the SIM to find this evidence to prove this thing that you're saying? I think that's really important for not only the management to understand your thought process, but also to train others and to help others understand your investigation. And when did you take these actions? So this is a secondary timestamp, right? So not only the timestamps of the events that may have taken place on the machine, but also when did you pull this log? Like, create a timeline of the events that you went throughout the course of your investigation, right? I reached out to this user at this time via email, and you have basically you have the evidence of that in your inbox or your sent box, whatever. What answers did you obtain, right? So what questions did you ask yourself? You don't have to put the questions in the write-up, but what did you learn from this? And of course, is escalation required, right? Did you find this to be something where you've already escalated it? And it's just really important to keep that somewhere in the write-up, probably mostly on top, that you did reach out to someone and this was already escalated and this is the bottom line, right? So what is your conclusion? This is really important, right? This is all providing facts. This is all not necessarily your opinion on this thing, right? Your leadership and those that need to make decisions based on your analysis want to hear what your conclusion is. They don't want to hear the facts. And one of the things that was really hard for me to understand early on was sometimes you need to be very honest about not knowing, what happened. Let's say that, for example, you tried to investigate an event and you realized that you did not have the visibility into that specific log that would have told you if this was a false positive or a true positive. Well, that's definitely a huge takeaway from the investigation, and hopefully there's a way that you can, inject that information into your visibility improvement process, as a SOC. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're creating a conclusion. And this was really hard for me to learn, and that's the bluff. I write a lot, I talk a lot, and I get really excited about things like this. So it's really important to put a bluff, a bottom line up front at the very top of your write-up to let your management know, since understanding the audience is important. People are busy, right? People are doing things. Understand really quickly in a few minutes, if that, why they're even receiving this write-up in the first place, why it matters. And of course, provide some contextual data. Timestamps, really important. User endpoint information, right? So let's say you have a user account associated. It is that user, what is their job title? That may be very interesting for your leadership. What if it's a VIP user, for example? What if it's a server? And any related OSINT data that you find is always really helpful to add more to your investigation. Okay, so the bottom line up front, the bluff here, right? Summarize all the key information. Put it all into one paragraph all the way at the top. And I try to remind myself of the 3 C's, and that is to be concise, clear, and correct. Try to use active voice, try not to passively say things, and be very clear about the information and your conclusion about something. And just make sure you're correct, right? And make sure that you didn't accidentally say this is a false positive just because you mistake the true and false word. Just be very correct. Honestly, I've had to send my reports or my write-ups to my fellow analysts, and I'm like, hey, can you read this really quickly to make sure that it's right or that it sounds good before I send this out? That's also really helpful. Again, that goes back to leaning on your peers. Because you want to make sure that these three C's are checked in order to make your bluff statement incredibly impactful for the write-up. So lastly, write-up importance. Your write-up can invoke change in a process, right? That's really important to understand. What if your investigation led to the discovery of a visibility gap, for example, right? And your management or your leadership team, whomever, they want to reference your documentation, your write-up, in order to invoke this change, in order to make a change in the organization. Can they just forward your write-up, right? Is it ready? Did you write it with that expectation? Or do they have to come back and reach out to you and ask you for a summary of your write-up? Those are never fun. I've had to do it before because, again, this is all a learning experience. But just try to write your write-ups with that expectation that it may be used as reference material, right? Another one here, I said this before, can someone replicate the actions you took? Can you train someone based on this investigation that you wrote up? Can you give them this documentation and ask them, hey, see if you can pull these logs, these things from this machine? Does that make sense to you? And of course, something else to keep in mind, did this investigation lead to a potential improvement in detection? That's the whole point, right? Is to continue to improve our detections as analysts to make our jobs easier and to protect our companies. So of course, would senior leadership be able to use this write-up to address any concerns? Can they forward it up? That's just a reminder here. And a last question to ask yourself here, did you document your findings or your conclusions in some kind of a wiki? I don't know what people have out there, whatever, OneNote, I'm not sure, but somewhere that it can be easily referenced, it can be searchable so that everyone can learn from this process. It's something to keep in mind while you're doing these write-ups. Okay, so now we're at the summary. Questions drive an investigation. They're key. They're, the questions, the quality of the questions that you ask yourself determines the quality of your investigation, which is something really important. build an effective hypothesis, or remember those three terms that I used earlier. Just make sure that you spend a little bit of time trying to think about what your thoughts are initially about this investigation. It really helps drive everything. So answers to your question form the foundation of a write-up. It doesn't mean that it is the write-up. It's the foundation, and you build off of that. An analyst reflects their efforts through write-ups. I love to read that because it's so true. What leadership sees is your write-ups. They don't see the amount of hours you spent looking at logs, unless you're sharing your screen and showing them something, which is always cool. Always include a bluff statement. People are busy. You don't want to bore anybody either. Make sure that the information that they need is right up front and ready to go. And I'll leave it with, just keep asking questions. It's helped me throughout my career, and it continues to help me. And it's just super important for us as analysts in the field. And these are some resources. So I learned a lot from Chris Sanders' investigation theory course. It's one of the best courses I've ever taken. I mean, Chris Sanders is amazing. And it really helps to understand how investigations work. There's some writing tips by Lenny. I mean, this is perfect. A lot of this stuff about like being more clear and concise comes from that. Generating hypothesis, Robert M. Lee, right, for threat hunting, which is something that we do all the time as analysts. And one of the most impactful books that I've read is Thinking Fast and Slow, because it really helps you understand your biases, which we didn't really cover here in this presentation, but like confirmation bias, for example, and false positive bias that happens to a lot of analysts after being bombarded by so many bad detections, arguably bad detections. And of course, Communicating with Intelligence. This was a book that I read because of a class that I took, and I was blown away by how amazing it was to help with like my writing skills. So that's another book there that I think is really good to share. And that's it. That's all I have. And of course, I mean, I want to say thank you to everybody, Grim, everybody. I mean, these conversations are awesome. So really appreciate it.
That was amazing. Thank you, Christopher. That was great. I'm trying to look through for some of the Q&A in there. Somebody, it was me, since you mentioned the UTC is like, just set everything to UTC. There's a Teespring shirt and like stickers and such for UTC or GTFO, which is one of my favorite SOC analyst and forensicator phrases that I've heard a few times, right?
Yes.
There's one correct location to set your servers, network switches, etc. You can make a strong argument for user machines as well. Just standardize everything to UTC. Time zone conversions is so much a pain. Like, yes. Oh, I'm investigating now, but when the event happened, it was still daylight savings. So let me modify for 3 hours for the location difference and another hour for the time zone difference. Oh, but wait, I'm in a county that doesn't do time zone, so it's only 3 hours. Or wait, no, it's 5 hours. Just UTC everywhere. That's yes. One tip that by itself justifies your talk. And there was a lot more all the way through as well. Let's see. I did want to emphasize your little nugget. So I usually am writing like pen test reports, different focus, but the same idea of conveying a message to the reader or different readers at different levels. And I loved the nugget you said. A competent reader of the report should be able to follow along the steps that you actually used.
Yes.
Not just anyone outside of IT, but someone somewhat familiar with another SOC analyst or junior SOC analyst, or probably even the manager of the SOC itself should be able to follow along and go through the same steps and with the same questions, because you identified them in your report, should come to the same conclusion. Otherwise, there's some logical fallacy going on or some bias on your own side. So I love that. In other words, every report could also be training material for others, because there is not enough time in this world for everyone to find the answers themselves. This is why we share, which may be a recurring theme that after every little banter that I keep bringing up. So first of all, thank you. Great talk. I love the background on it. I love the little nuggets about like, we didn't have time for biases, but it turns out they're pretty important. Completely agree on all parts. One question for you. Yeah. And this one's always tougher, and I admit some personal interest here as well. Seeing good incident reports is a valuable thing. A lot of them are, constrained to the organization for very obvious reasons. Are you aware of any public either good examples or bad examples of incident reports that you would point at and say, this is an available resource?
That's tough, because I would have to think about that. One of the ways that one of the things that helped me out very much was the Chris Sanders class that he gave, and also the book that I referenced there that for the class that I took. That was one of the best ways of like writing. It wasn't really, well, it's more about like national security and all that stuff, right? But it was super helpful to understand like your audience and like why you're writing this in the first place. That was the most helpful thing for me, but I would have to look to see like examples that I can share for that.
Okay. If you're in Discord, we'd love to have you share it anytime that you can. Commentary online, shout out to Ghost305, nice presentation. I've had to learn to ask questions no matter what. In the past, I felt I might look stupid and finally realized I don't and shouldn't care. Knowledge and learning is what is important. I completely agree there.
I want to add something to that was really hard for me to understand too. So, I did not have any experience coming into InfoSec, right? I knew about IT, but I wasn't a sysadmin, so I wasn't even really that much in IT, right? I was break fix IT. And, I was so worried about asking questions when I first started because I didn't want to look dumb, right? No one wants to look dumb, right? And what I realized over time is that if you have a question and it's a big enough group, you're probably not the only one that's wondering that. There's just more than one person that doesn't want to look dumb. So if anything, just go out there and ask that question because you may end up helping not only yourself, but someone else, so that's the way I kind of took it.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
So, which branch did you serve in, by the way?
What?
Beard, bottom line up front. So, military?
No, nothing.
Oh man, I would have bet money. I would have bet money in the military.
I would have put some money on that. Okay.
No. That's really funny you bring that up, because when I first started in the SOC, it was primarily people that were from the military in my team. So that's probably where all this came from. I learned a lot from them. So there you go. I just reflect that.
Okay.
Yeah, because we got almost the same background. I started with the Coast Guard and everything.
Wow.
So yeah, that's why I learned a lot of that stuff. Like I said, my military was me, find me. I asked too many questions, but yeah. But no, oh my God, I have so much to say about this. I love it because this is something that I work in and I try to teach. Not really just investigation theory, but even asking questions. And people who wanted to learn, I guess, more reports. Now, this is more from a threat intel side. I know Unit 42 puts out like post-threat reports. I think those are really good, like threat intel reports. I'll post a link up as well. Man, the biases. I know I took I took a threat intel training course, right? It was funny. It was funny. I liked it. It was great, but bringing out those biases was very key and critical. Especially when we were talking about like, hey, do you have biases? Like, no, not really. And then put up some controversial just pictures. It wasn't like not safe for work stuff. It was just controversial. It's like, what do you think? What is your opinion? And things like that. So it really helps. And there's a huge thing. Like you said, Chris Sanders is probably one person I probably follow who really has a lot of this stuff almost down to a T. There's even some other studies when, even writing, he was talking about like, hey, any word over like 8 characters is like too long. Make it simpler. If it's over 10 characters, it was so deep in detail and depth in putting those reports. I even see some companies.
A fancy word where a simple one will do. Jargon is useful if both sides understand the same term for the same meaning. Outside of that audience, which is a really common situation, avoid jargon, damn it.
Yes.
Because you'll just confuse the audience, or worse yet, they'll walk away with a different understanding because they have a different understanding of that word. Jargon is
one of the most difficult things for me to learn about writing more concisely, which is so difficult, was I like using a lot of the LY words, beautifully, right? Things like that, like just to make it sound nicer because I want it to be pretty. And it ends up being super wasteful and no one wants to read that. And it was so hard to understand that you have to be very selective with your word choices because people don't have time to sit there and like read something pretty. They want to read like the fact.
Yep, I actually got clients brought it. Another CISO and other pen test head person brought up that I was using like unfortunately, fortunately, things like to chain together sentences, and you're mixing your opinion and that flowery language with what it should be fairly objective, given my background, given my understanding, this is the situation.
Yes.
And it's not just that it takes more words, it's that to some audiences, you are diluting your message because you're freely trading back and forth between this is my casual opinion on things and this is the fact.
Yes.
So
and the goal
you're actively hurting your portrayal of reality sometimes by some of that flowery language. It's okay for things to feel rather blunt all the way through. Your report is not to swaddle the reader all the way through from beginning to end. It is to lay out a story, if you will, yes, but here's the situation, here's what I understood the initial alert to mean, here are the follow-up questions that it brought to me, and here's the resolution conclusion. And by the way, start off with your bottom line up front, your TLDR for the commercial world.
And also carry on with that, like you said, Chris, it's hard to kind of write concise. I just shared some links, some things that I use in my job. Word rake is I love it because it takes those, really, what it does, it takes a sentence that really wordy and things like that, like, hey, cut this out, you can still say the same thing without doing that. Something I truly invest in any report I write. I highly suggest it. It's like $120. You get 150 for like the word and office you. Something I use daily because it's written for more lawyers per se, and so lawyers have to kind of use certain language, but it takes out all the other extra words that's not needed and makes it really concise. Another application I use, Hemingway Editor. It definitely helps you with Hemingway's Editor. It helps you out with active voice. That it put everything in more an active voice. Also, another thing is Perfected that I use. This is more like make sure your content is really uniform. Do you use ad hoc with the dash in the middle, or do you just use ad hoc the word? It helps with those little things, these little nitpick things they point out. So these are something that I love sharing. I love making sure that people understand, like, these tools are out here to help you write effectively. Use the tools that's out there to really just narrow things down and to really just make your writing clear, concise, and to the point. Word rake is probably the number one thing I use, and then Perfected is probably the second one. So definitely something to look at.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know about those. I just want to echo like one last thing here. The reason that this is so important is, again, like, this is where value is derived from your analysis. Like, this is all, at the end of the day, this is what people see. And I failed to see that for so long. And I'll never forget this one report that I wrote. I spent, I don't know, the whole day writing this report, and I could have sworn it was the best thing I've ever written since college or whatever, right? And I sent it to my lead analyst at the time, and they wrote back in a very kind manner. It wasn't that they were being mean, but they were like, "Why did you write this?" Right? And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Right? And that's when I failed to understand the audience very quickly. And then they're like, "I'm gonna send you back like my thoughts on it." And all I received was the entire thing was basically highlighted, and like how passive voice was used here. Like, why are you giving me your opinion here? Like, why is this? And then that's when I realized, man, this is a craft. This is something that I really got to get better at. I was writing like something like I was writing in my journal or something. I thought it was great. And the reality is it takes time to really get that ironed out. It really does.
This is not Dear Diary, today I investigated an antivirus alert.
No.
This is, hey, others, because this report will stand forever, regardless of my human context. I will not be able to explain this report to you. These words need to stand on their own. So, dear future readers, at this date, this started a bit of an incident, and here's the thought process of the analyst at the time, what data supported what conclusion, given the questions that came up along the process. Yes.
I
So much,
definitely
yeah.
want to add one more thing to this, and I'll let it go. I'll let this one go. But no, also in Word, when you're writing your documents in Word, make sure you turn on all the spell check features. Honestly, there's only a subset on by default. And honestly, a lot of people don't really know.
Grammar check is not, and Word has a lot of good grammar check.
They
I just
do.
want to shout out, since you mentioned WordRake, a lot of people use Grammarly, and I had to double check WordRake, and just my 10 seconds not good review of their privacy policy means they don't actually look at the content. It's local rules that are applied. Grammarly is not that way. That is a concern to many folk, that every
Correct.
text you analyze with Word or PowerPoint or web browser integration, you're sending that text to Grammarly. That's probably not okay. WordRake on my 15-second review does not do that, but be careful when you're installing other people's software that has access to this information, because it has access to this information that is probably not meant to be publicly shared.
Right. And so, like, I mean, definitely use Word. Word is something, yeah, I personally vouch. For people who want a Grammarly style thing, what I found to use, I used it a little bit. White Smoke is pretty much the same as Grammarly. I believe they don't, if I read it correctly, I believe they don't, you don't send your information to White Smoke. They're, like I said, they're pretty much the same thing as Grammarly. And as far as like grammar content and everything, but getting your writing together, definitely utilize the tools out here. It's one of the best investments I make when writing anything, from email to report to anything that goes beyond me or maybe a colleague of mine. I run it through WordRate first, perfect it next to make sure everything's uniform, and I'm taking out all the extra wording in there. And those, I can't highly recommend those two products.
That's a fair point. Okay,
Thanks,
I have another thing to look for as well. So I believe you're providing value to the audience, but you're providing value to me, and that's good enough to start off with. So I'm happy with that. So Christopher, I need to introduce our next section. Any last comment before we switch over?
No, keep asking questions regardless of how dumb they might seem in your mind. Just keep asking them. That's how you get better.
Yep. I rephrased slightly in a Discord post and said, I'd rather appear like a fool for a moment and ask a stupid question than actually be a fool on that subject forever because I didn't ask that question.
Definitely. Perfect.
Yep. Thank you very much, Lopez.